Masechet Yevamot, Daf Tet Zayin. I'd like to clarify one point from yesterday. We are in the middle of 11 cases discussing the question, did Bet Shamai practice their own opinion? It's a historical question. Or did they all practice like Bet Hillel? It seems pretty evident from the Tanaitic sources that are being used as proofs that Bet Shammai did in fact practice their own opinion during that time period. Nevertheless, the Talmud is trying to see if we can accord all of those sources with the Amoraic opinions that said Bet Shammai submitted to Bet Hillel. And in the course of these 11 cases, the first and the last three prove quite definitively that yes, indeed, Bet Shammai followed their own opinion. In the second to last case that we ended off with yesterday, we have the students of Rabbi Yoshua asking him, what's your opinion about this? And he says, I don't want to give an answer because I'm afraid my crush will be skulled between my skull will be crushed between two mountains. But he says, but know that Kohanim Gedolim did come from such unions. Okay, and now in that discussion, we said, why does he have to even bother mentioning anything about the grandchildren and what their status is? It seems clear from Rabbi Yoshua that he in fact agrees with Bet Hillel. And so if so, then why does he have to give an opinion about what the grandchildren would be? And our answer is, well, it has an effect on what he would say about Machzir Gerushato, about someone who retakes his divorcee. Because they are the same status, they're both Isur Lav. And so what is the status of their children? Would they be totally kosher or pagum, like a halal or halala? And so with the two sides of the debate were based on a kal vachomer that I want to clarify, that said, almana to kohen gadol, a kohen gadol is prohibited to an almana, and that prohibition is particular to a kohen gadol. Other kohanim are allowed to marry an almana. And yet, bena pagum, and that causes the children to be pagum. So this case, machzir gerushato, which is a law that is applicable on all people, all kohanim, all Israel. So all the more so that it will cause the children to be pagum. That's the positive side. That yes, it causes someone who returns his divorcee will cause the children to be pagumim. The other side is on the other hand, if an almana does illegally have relations with a kohen gadol, she herself is now going to be prohibited to all kohanim, whereas she was mutar to kohanim before because she's a widow, but now this is almana, a widow. So she was only prohibited to kohen gadol. If she has relations with a kohen gadol, she herself, besides the children, is prohibited to all kohanim. That is not true for machzir gerushato. Now, what's strange about this case is someone who returns a divorcee, she is a divorcee, so she is already prohibited to all kohanim. But that's not the point. The point is now she does not become prohibited to kohanim. She was already, for a different reason, because of a divorcee, not because she violated this law. The difference would be seen in her ability to eat terumah. If she is a bat kohen and single, she can eat terumah. Even if she violates the law, this law, and she may remarry someone else and goes back to her first husband, and is married to a kohen, or is bat kohen is single, she can still eat terumah. In other words, she's not a halala. She could never marry a kohen because of the prohibition of a divorcee, but it's not because of this reason, and not because she violated this sin. And so that's the second side of it. And the answer is, in fact, that is what I think. Sarot mitirani bnei sarot ani me'id lachem. I'm afraid only to tell you about the sarot themselves, but the children of the sarot are permitted, and therefore also the children of someone who returns his divorcee also would be totally kosher. So that's the final answer there. And we learn from here the fact that he was afraid. Why would he be afraid if Bet Shammai all practiced like Bet Hillel? Doesn't make sense. He would only be afraid to give an answer if Bet Shammai practiced their own opinion. And so that was the second to last proof. And now we're ready for the last proof. Tashema. Bimei Rabbi Dosa ben Harkina sutra sarat tabat le'achin shema mina asu shema mina. This is a story. We're going to see the full story in just a moment, but the short version of the story is in the time of Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas. It was permitted. Doesn't say who permitted it. We'll see that. Sarat Habat was permitted to the brothers. In other words, someone permitted it. They permitted it following Bet Shamai. So that proves that Bet Shamai did, in fact, practice their opinion. Right? These whoever did, a certain sage or sages permitted it and followed Bet Shamai and put it into practice. So that's a clear proof. There's no way around it. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the 11 cases. But now that we mentioned this really interesting story, let's see the details of the story. Gufa. During the time of Dosa ben Harkinas, he was a very old sage and lived during the end of the second Bet HaMikdash, lived through the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, and apparently lived a long time, even into the next generation. And during his time period, doesn't say who. We'll see why it doesn't say who. Hitiru sarata bat achin. Someone permitted a man whose daughter was married to his brother, and that brother also had another wife and died without children. They permitted that brother, the Yavam, to perform yibum to the co-wife of his daughter, following Bet Shamai. And the sages were very upset about this. Apparently, at this time already, people were mostly following Bet Hillel, and all of a sudden, this great sage, they thought it was Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas that permitted it, and he was a great wise sage. And another in manuscripts it says also Vezaken Gadol Haya, he was elderly and his eyes had dimmed, so he could not come to the Bet HaMidrash. And so they were not aware of what he was doing because he was on his own there, and he was not aware maybe of what was going on in the Bet Midrash. And so independently he permitted this. This was a big problem because he was so well respected and knowledgeable. If he goes against Bet Hillel, that could really break the tide. And if the majority and most people are already now following Bet Hillel, all of a sudden this is going to open up people following Bet Shamai, and that will cause a problem of lotit kodedu, a breakage, a possible mamzerut, that according to one and not according to the other. And so the rabbis were very concerned about this. So they said someone has to go and confront Rabbi Dosa ben Harkinas about this, even though he's a great sage and everyone's a little afraid to do that. So Amar who's going to go tell him? Amar lehen Rabbi Yoshua ani elech. Rabbi Yoshua, he had confidence. He said, okay, I'll take it upon myself and I will go. Who else? He's not going to go alone. We need a team to gang up on him. Strength in numbers. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. So these three sages, Rabbi Yoshua seems to be the oldest of them. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, we saw in the previous story, he had Zechut Avot, right? Rabbi Akiva was perhaps the greatest of the sages among them, but the youngest and didn't have great lineage. And so they go in that order. And so they go to the entrance of his house, and his maidservant goes and tells Rabbi Dosa, Rabbi, the sages of Israel have come to you. I like how so formal that she has to, they have to be introduced by the maidservant. Amarla yikansu v'nichnesu, and so he said, yes, let them enter, and they entered. Tefasod Rabbi Yoshua hoshibahu al mitah shel zahav. Rabbi Dosa gives them a grand entrance, and he grabs Rabbi Yoshua, that who already knew. Rabbi Yoshua was the oldest of them, still much younger than Rabbi Dosa. But he says, yes, I know you, and he has him sit on a bed of gold. And he didn't know the other sages, so he invited them. Rabbi Yoshua, tell your colleagues that they can come and sit. They're not going to sit until they're invited to do so. Amar lo mihu, and he says, who is this? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So Rabbi Yoshua told Rabbi Dosa, this is Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Amar v'yeshlo ben Azariah chaverenu. He says, wow, I can't believe that Azariah, my friend, all right, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's father was a contemporary who knew Rabbi Dosa. And he says, oh, I'm so happy that my colleague has a son who is learned and is here. Nice to meet you. Kara alava mikra hazeh nad hayiti gam zakanti v'lo ra'iti sadik. Na'ezav v'zaro mebakesh lachem. And Rabbi Dosa said about him the pasuk, I was old, I was young, and now I'm old. I never seen a righteous person forsaken or his seed begging for bread. And he interprets this not literally that they're someone poor begging for bread, but the point is that I never saw a tzaddik whose children don't continue in his footsteps and also are forsaken, but rather are also Talmidei Chachamim. And so I knew your father Elazar, and so I'm happy to see that you see when a righteous person also has their descendants follow in their ways and are full of bread. Torah. And so he grabs him and has him sit down also on a bed of gold. So Rabbi Dosa says, Rabbi Yoshua, tell your other student to sit down. See how he's younger, he calls him his Talmid. Amar lo, who's that? Akiva ben Yosef. He says, this is Akiva ben Yosef. Amar lo, atahu Akiva ben Yosef, sheshimcha holech misof ha'olam va'ad sofo. He says, wow, you're the one, the famous Akiva ben Yosef. Your reputation goes from one end of the world to another. Right? I've heard of your greatness in Torah. Shev beni shev, kemotcha yirbu b'Yisrael. Sit, may there be many more like you. Right? What a beautiful welcome from this elder. And so now you have to go think about what's going through their minds. They're coming to challenge Rabbi Dosa and disagree with him and tell him he has to change his mind about his ruling. And now he's giving them all this praise. So how are they going to confront him? How are they going to bring up this sensitive topic? So they start off by beating around the bush. And they encircle him with different halachot. This encircling with halachot may remind us of the story of the oven of Achnai, where they surround the oven or surround Rabbi Eliezer with words and crush him like a snake. So this Misabebin has an ominous tone to it. So they're going from one topic to another and zeroing in on this one. So by the way, that reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you about the daughter's co-wife. So they asked him, what's your opinion about this? Rabbi Dosa says, oh, I know, that's a machloket between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. Very simple. Remember, Rabbi Yoshua gave the same answer. Yes, we know that already, but halacha kedivrei mi, right? They're pinning him down. Amalan halacha kedivrei Bet Hillel. Yeah, we follow Bet Hillel. No problem. So Rabbi Dosa has no issue. They must have been so relieved. They said, we're astounded. We heard a rumor in your name that you were preaching that halacha is like Bet Shammai. And we were really worried about this, and we came to confront you about it. So we're kind of surprised that now all of a sudden you're saying Bet Hillel. What's going on? He says, Amar lehem dosa shematem o ben harkinas shematem. What exactly did you hear in this rumor? Did you hear them say that Dosa is the one that said halacha is Bet Shammai, my first name, or did you hear them say my last name, the son of Harkinas? And they said, oh, we didn't hear the first name. We just heard Ben Harkinas. Oh, this is a common mistake. That's my little brother. He's also Ben Harkinas. Bechor Satanhu. And I'll tell you something about him. Even though he's my little brother, he's the firstborn of Satan, meaning he's very tough and he's very learned, and he will, we call it devil's advocate. He was the devil's advocate, right? But he was sincere about it. He had opposing views, and he could be very sharp in his criticism. So he's the firstborn of Satan. Satan is known for being argumentative, always against people. He's the chief prosecutor. V'Yonatan Shemo, his name is Yonatan ben Harkinas, not Dosa ben Harkinas. Shamai, he is a student of Shamai. You got the wrong person. Okay, this happens sometimes. I remember about 4 years ago, a friend of mine invited someone, an author who writes about Israel to his synagogue, and the rabbi was very against it. And they were arguing and arguing. No, you can't bring this speaker. He says he writes all wrong things. And my friend was saying, no, he's very good. I read everything he wrote. Turns out they got the same name, a similar name, or two different authors from opposite political perspectives. And so then they realized that they're talking about two different people. So this really happens, and this was a common mistake. I know everyone thinks that it was me. Okay. Vehizaharu shelo yekapech etchem bahalachot. Dosa adds and says, be careful if you're going to go visit him. He will batter you with halachot about this matter. He has 300 proofs regarding sarat habat that is permitted, like Bet Shamai. This reminds me of another story. The best mohel in our community is Maris Abraham. He has a cousin also named Maris Abraham who prays in my synagogue. So I just asked him yesterday. I said, "Do you get a lot of people calling you?" He says, "All the time, right?" He says, "Are you free on Thursday?" He says, "Yeah, I'm free, but I don't think you want me to do it. You want my cousin." Okay, so he says, "Listen, this is my brother, but be very careful about it." אבל מעיד אני עלי שמיים וארץ שעל מדוכה זו ישב חגי הנביא ואמר שלושה דברים שרת הבת אסורה עמון ומואב מעשרין מעשר אני בשביעית ומקבלין גרין מן הקרדויין ומן התרמודין. He says, okay, he's giving them a warning about going to visit, but he says, listen, whatever he tells you, and he has 300 proofs, and maybe you're going to be convinced or upset, and not know how to answer it. But I'm telling you, don't worry. I will testify upon the heavens and earth that on this very mortar, he had a mortar, the bottom of a flour mill, that was a very old one from the time of Haggai. And Haggai sat on this very mortar. So apparently this would be, Haggai was in the beginning of right before the second Bet HaMikdash was built. So this would have had to have been a 600-year-old mortar that Rabbi Dosa had in his house. Maybe he liked archaeology. And he said, on this very mortar, I testify. Haggai sat, he wasn't there 600 years earlier, but he has a tradition. And Haggai said about three matters. And he said, Sarat habat asura, one may not take in Yibum his daughter's co-wife, and so then you don't have to do chalitza at all, like Bet Hillel. You can go and marry anybody else. So in other words, I have an old tradition about this, and so don't you worry and don't listen to my brother. While he's mentioning this tradition, Haggai also talked about two other things that we will elaborate in detail. That's Amon and Moab, these lands that are near Israel. They have to give ma'aser during a Shivi'it year. During a Shivi'it year in Israel, you can't work the land, and there's no ma'aser. But in these lands that are close by, they are not officially part of Israel, and so therefore you're allowed to work them on Shivi'it. And the rabbis declared that one should give a tenth of whatever is produced there to the poor to help sustain them during the Shivi'it year when nothing else is growing in Israel. So that's another thing. That's the status of those lands. And then the third is that we can accept converts from these two places. Karduyin is probably the Kurds in Kurdistan, and Tarmodim are those people that come, we'll see, from Palmyra. These are people who are not Jewish, and therefore, if they want to convert, they can come convert. This is opposed to another opinion that says, well, maybe they were Jewish and maybe they're mamzerim. And if they are possibly Jewish and were not careful with their marriage laws and they have mamzerim on them, we'd rather they stay in the non-Jewish community there rather than, they don't have to convert because they'd be Jewish. But if they convert, then they're going to join our community and bring mamzerut. So, it's easier to perform conversion on someone that's totally not Jewish. Then they perform conversion, then they're totally good Jews. That's great. But if we suspect that there are a number of Jews within this non-Jewish population, then we suspect that there are mamzerim and we don't want to accept them. So he testified that this was a controversial issue. All these are three controversial issues. And he's testifying that Haggai said that they are okay, you can convert. Okay, Tana. Now, a continuation of the story. When the three rabbis came in, they came in through one entrance, but they left through three different entrances. Why? There's many different explanations. I think the simplest one is that they came into one entrance because they were all confident, and they came and says, we're going to confront this rabbi and settle this matter. But then they realized that they accused Rabbi Dosa wrongly, and so they were embarrassed. And so after that, even though Rabbi Dosa praised them and made them feel good, nevertheless their mission was over, and so now they dispersed. They didn't have to go anywhere. Others say that they left through three different entrances because they didn't want to confront Rabbi Dosa, so they kind of scattered so they wouldn't have to find him. Okay, that leaving through three entrances actually comes from the Yerushalmi version of the story, where they leave not Rabbi Dosa, but they leave Rabbi Yonatan from three different entrances, and there it's surely out of shame. And I'll show you that contrasting story in a minute. Okay, anyway, so they leave before Rabbi Dosa. Mission accomplished. We thought it was Rabbi Dosa, but it turns out Rabbi Dosa was fine. We got the wrong person. And then they're walking, Pagabo, Rabbi Akiva, separately. And Rabbi Akiva happened to meet Rabbi Yonatan ben Harkinas while he was walking. Encountered him. Rabbi Yonatan ben Harkinas raised all these objections and stood him up. I know the translation says here he was able to respond to them. I don't think it means that. I think ukmeh means that he was stumped. Rabbi Akiva was silent, and he's like, all these questions, I don't know how to answer it. Amar lo, atahu Akiva sheshimcha holech misof haolam ve'ad sofo. So Rabbi Yonatan said, are you the famous Akiva, that your reputation goes from one end of the earth to the other? That's the same thing that Rabbi Dosa said, right? Ashrecha shezachita l'shem ve'adayin lo higata l'ro'eh bakar. But then he turns it around to an insult, and he says, praiseworthy are you that you merited to have such a great reputation, even though you have, in your stature and your knowledge, you have not even reached the level of a cattle herder. So it's a backhanded compliment, right? He's saying, you're really lucky to have such a great reputation when you don't deserve it at all. You're even less learned than a cattle herder. Well, very common job. And Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, afilu lero'eh bakar. Rabbi Akiva, in his humility, said, you're giving me too much credit. I'm not even worthy to be ro'eh son, a sheep herder. Sheep herder is even a lower level job than a cattle herder. So he says, I'm nothing. You're right. I never claimed to be anybody great, right? And the person can't control their own reputation. Others say that ro'eh bakar is actually ro'eh son is actually prohibited because son go around and they eat from other people's property. Okay, but I could just mean here that he's a lowly, unlearned person. And that is the end of the story. Kind of surprising to end on such a difficult note, whereas this whole time, you see that we were trying to prove, is it possible to say that Rabbi Bet Shamai followed Bet Hillel? And we said, no, the last three proofs are for sure not. Bet Shamai followed their own opinion. And then we have this story with the rabbis all confident, and Rabbi Dosa giving them confidence and saying, you're right, Bet Hillel's right. But the story ends with Rabbi Akiva having no answer and being stumped and insulted by Rabbi Yonatan ben Harkinas. And I think this shows the kind of ambivalence and pluralism, tolerance in the Talmud Bavli, saying, listen, of course we follow Bet Hillel now, but this is after a long struggle, and Bet Shammai had their opinion and they followed it, and they even have, good arguments to back them up. Okay, if we can take a minute to look at the parallel story in the Talmud Yerushalmi, I think you'll find it very interesting, where we have a story about elders who went to visit Rabbi Dosa and asked him about the case of the daughter's co-wife. And they said to him, are you the one who permits the co-wife? He said, did you hear about that rumor from Dosa ben Hadkinas? They said, no, we only heard about Ben Hadkinas. He says, oh, that's my brother Yonatan, firstborn of Satan. He's a student of Shamai. Be careful because he has 300 proofs about the daughter's co-wife. So see, it's very similar so far. So they went to him. The Dosa sent a letter to his brother saying, be wary as the sages of Israel are coming to you. So in this version, the Dosa sends a message both to the rabbis, be careful for my brother, and he also tells his brother, be careful of the rabbis, right? These are two great great minds coming together, and he's afraid that they're going to insult each other, and won't, it's not going to work out well. So they entered and sat before, and they sat before them. In this Yerushalmi version, all three rabbis specifically go to the Yonatan ben Dosa, and they want to confront him. He, the Yonatan ben Hadkinas. So the Yonatan ben Hadkinas was explaining his arguments to the three rabbis, but they did not understand. They couldn't follow his reason. He was so far advanced. He explained to them again, but they didn't understand. They began to doze off. When you're not following, then you start falling asleep, and the Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues are falling asleep. He said to them, why are you dozing? And the Yonatan began to throw pebbles at them. Right? I told you I couldn't skip.
Don't do that to us, please.
I can't throw pebbles over Zoom. Some say that they entered through one doorway and exited through three. Right? So he's throwing rocks at them, and they can't follow what he's saying. And so they entered one all confident, but now they have to sneak out. They're scatting, and that's why they exit through three. So I think the Yerushalmi is the original version of the story, and you see explained very well why they left through three versions, because they were in front of Rabbi Yonatan. He sent and told Rabbi Dosa, who did you send me? These are people who have yet to learn, and you tell me these are the sages of Israel? I should be careful of them, right? They have nothing. They couldn't even answer one of my arguments. They couldn't even follow one of my arguments, and so there was no need to warn me about them. Although his first warning was good, the warning to the three rabbis: be careful with my brother. Okay, so now that they leave the Yonatan and they're all depressed, they come back to the Dosa and they ask him, as for you, what do you say about the co-wife? You never told us what your opinion was. And now he says, oh, upon this mortar, Chagai came and he testified that yes, the daughter's co-wife is fine. She can even marry a Kohen. I mean, she's not a Chalutza. That's like Bet Hillel. So he confirms that. And then he says, lift up my eyes. I want to see the sages of Israel. He gives them kavod, calls them sages. And he turns to each one in turn and gives them kavod and says a pasuk about them and about the Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Says, I was old and now I grow young and I never saw, right, not Hayiti, the same pasuk as quoted in the Bavli. And so now he calms them down and says, don't worry about it. So you see the order in the Yerushalmi is flipped, that first they all three go and, well, first they come to the Dosa, he says, not me. Then they go to Yonatan, who insults them and they feel rejected. But the story ends on a happy note, coming back to the Dosa confirming, I have a tradition from Chagai, and he praises them all. So I think the order of the two versions of the story and a lot of the details in them are very significant, showing that the Yerushalmi also in the part before emphasizes the opinion that Bet Shamai followed Bet Hillel. Right, that's much more prominent in the Yerushalmi, and here also ending with Bet Hillel kind of winning the day. So yeah, I think the Yerushalmi wants to emphasize Bet Hillel much more, and the Bavli is giving more credit and opening a possibility for the legitimacy of Bet Shammai. Perhaps part of the reason is that Yerushalmi is earlier, where maybe there were still people who might have been thinking about following Bet Shammai, so we got to close that door, whereas by the time the Bavli comes, no one's following Bet Shammai, it's long gone. So it's not as dangerous to bring up that possibility, and now they can entertain those arguments that Bet Shammai did in fact have, and recognize that they also have truth and the elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim aspect of it. Okay.
Rabbi, quick question. I'm just sorry. What's the time period of Rabbi Dosa compared to Hillel and Shamai?
Great question. Hillel and Shamai are earlier, maybe 200 years, like 100 and no, so not that much earlier. Hillel and Shamai are around the year 0, and Rabbi Dosa is around the destruction, which is 70. CE.
Okay.
So it would be, a couple of generations later. So he wouldn't have known them. But Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai are after Hillel and Shammai themselves, right? So their houses, their schools, their yeshivot continued at least until the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, although we don't hear as much about them after the destruction. All right, so that concludes that amazing story. And now, since we mentioned that Haggai talks about this a second topic, well, we're going to analyze that. Amon and Moab masirin ma'asar ani b'shevi'it amar mor. Harbe kerachim kavshu ole Misraim velo kavshu ole Bavel. The first generation of Israelites who came from Egypt and came and conquered Israel. They conquered many cities that then many generations later, and when those who were exiled to Babel returned to Israel, did not conquer those places. All those places, and that would include Amon and Moab, although they were conquered in the first time around, that conquering and making it holy was not permanent. And so because they did not reconquer them, they were not holy. Not holy means they're not an official part of Israel, and that's why one can work them during a Shevi'it year. And in fact, those who came from Babel purposely did not conquer these lands. They did not make them sacred as part of Israel, because they knew that every seventh year there's going to be a terrible famine in Israel. And so they want to leave a possibility of people that will be in Amon and Moab and will work the land there and produce food, and then they will give that food to the poor. And so that's the source for this. And I think that's why it's relating to Haggai, right? Haggai was one of the Nevi'im who was around for Ole Bavel when they were coming from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. So it makes sense. He would have been one of the people directing traffic and telling them that this would be a good idea. Okay. So the tradition from Haggai said that we accept converts from these places. In other words, we consider them to be not Jewish. So they're totally, so we don't have to worry about mamzerut. There's no, non-Jews marrying non-Jews doesn't produce, is all good. There's no mamzerim, then they come convert, so we can totally accept them. We have a contradiction. And mekabelin gerin min hakarduim. We have a baraita from Rami Bar Yechezkel that says we do not accept converts from these karduyim. Karduyim. Amar Isha Ashe Kartuyim itmar. Rav Ashe says, no, he didn't say that. Rabbi Yechezkel said Kartuyim, different people. I think this is interesting. That's related to the previous story when we were confused about two brothers, right? And now we're confused about two different sounding peoples, right? Karduyim are just fine. That's what Haggai says. And Kartuyim, they're the problem. Everybody, go ask anybody in the street. Everybody knows Kartuyim, stay away from them. They cannot be, we cannot marry into them. Okay, or another version of what we just said. Same thing. We do not accept gerim from these kartuyim. My love, hainu kartuyim, hainu karduyim. So at first we're assuming these are the same thing. They just go by slightly different names. Sometimes two names that sound the same are actually referring to the same people, and so therefore that's a contradiction to the Mishnah. To the Haggai tradition that says kadurim are no good, and here he says they're okay. No, my Haggai said they're good, and now we're saying they're not okay. No, two different things. In other words, in this version, we don't have to change the words of the Baraita of Rami Bar Yechezkel. He said exactly the correct thing. We just interpreted him to mean Kartuyim are the same as Karduyim, and so Rav Ashe comes to say, no, when he said Kartuyim, he meant only Kartuyim. People say that the Kartuyim are the problem. Karduyim, the Kurds, they're okay, right? They're totally not Jewish. Okay means that they're not Jewish, and therefore they can convert. The Kartuyim are problematic because there may be some Jews among them who may be mamzerim, and therefore we don't accept them. All right, so that takes care of them. And now we get to the other people. So the Chagai had said that we accept converts from the Talmudim, and now Rabbi Yochanan says, and the elders said we don't. So this is a contradiction. Hold on, did Rabbi Yochanan actually say that we don't accept them? We're now going to prove that we do accept them from the following. V'hatanan is a Mishnah in Masechet Nida. It says, Kol ha'ketamim habayin min harekem tehorim, v'Rabbi Yehoshua Yehuda metameh, mipnei shem gerim v'to'im, miben hagoyim tehorim. So let me explain the Mishnah first, and then you'll see what Rabbi Yochanan has to do with this and how it's relevant. So a ketem is a cloth that's stained with blood, and if it's menstrual blood, and then if the ketem comes from a Jewish person, a Jewish woman, then we know it's tameh, and that's a proof that that person is tameh. If it comes from a non-Jew, however, the laws of impure cloths, blood-stained cloths, do not apply to non-Jews, and then it would be tahor. So the Mishnah says any ketamim that come from this place called rekem are tahor, meaning the women who live in rekem are not Jewish, so we don't have to worry about those bloodstains. Rabbi Yehuda says no, tameh. Why? Because gerim v'to'im, the people in Rekem actually have converted to Judaism. Although they're not practicing Judaism, they're to'im, they're in error. But even if someone converts and then later on they or their children don't practice Judaism at all, don't even remember that they're Jewish, doesn't matter. They still remain Jewish, right? Once you do a conversion, then they remain Jewish. So they may be in error, but they are Jewish, and therefore these bloodstains we have to assume are tameh. Okay, so that was machloket about the status of rekem. But then he adds, if it's mi ben hagoyim, he agrees that if it's a different city, that's a non-Jewish city, then any ketem from there is tahor. That's the Mishnah. Now, when on that Mishnah, we discussed it. Kapasek vetane mi ben hagoyim v'afilu min Talmud, and we noted that in the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, he just says, from any non-Jewish city, it's tahor. He didn't specify except for this, including this. He made a blanket statement, kapasik betaneh. He made a conclusive statement. And so that means any non-Jewish city, we can assume they're tahor, even Talmud also will be permitted. So Rabbi Yochanan zot omeret mekabelin gerim mitalmud. Rabbi Yochanan commented about that Mishnah that said, since we learned from that Mishnah that the bloodstains from the city of Talmud are pure, that means that those people are not Jewish. If they're not Jewish, then we can accept them as converts. If they were Jewish, then we would worry that they may be Jewish but married those prohibited to them and would be tameh. So we don't worry about it. And that proves that they are okay. Rabbi Yochanan now contradicts himself. At first, we quoted Chagai, who said you can marry the people of Talmud. Then Rabbi Yochanan said you cannot marry the people of Talmud. But here, Rabbi Yochanan himself says that you can convert the people of Talmud. So how are we going to reconcile the two statements of Rabbi Yochanan? Or maybe you'll say, really, Rabbi Yochanan himself thinks that you cannot convert these people. And when he says zot omeret, he is simply commenting on the Mishnah, that according to the Mishnah, you would be able to convert them. But he himself does not agree with the Mishnah and thinks you cannot. Rabbi Yochanan also said, he has a rule that we see in many places, that the law follows an anonymous Mishnah. This is an anonymous Mishnah. And so therefore, Rabbi Yochanan, by saying Zot Omeret, must agree with it. And our final answer is Amora Eninhu Valibad Rabbi Yochanan. In fact, there are two traditions, two Amoraim, who are arguing about what Rabbi Yochanan said. And so we're not going to reconcile them. Rabbi Yochanan said one thing or another, whatever he said. Interestingly, according to the first version of what the first statement of Rabbi Yochanan, he's disagreeing with Chagai the Navi, and we can wonder about that. How could you do that? How could you disagree with this old tradition going back to Chagai? And one possible answer is that we don't accept halakha from a Navi, right? A prophet can bring people to make teshuvah, but and warn people of impending punishment and so on, but is not authorized to make halakha. Even a bat kol, God himself coming down is not authorized to decide the halacha, and so maybe that's why he felt like he could disagree with that tradition from Haggai. Okay, so that's now we reconciled. We explained the two statements of Rabbi Yochanan, and now we ask Talmud Talmud, my ta'ama la. What's the problem of accepting converts with Talmud? Talmud, by the way, is also known as Palmyra. It comes from the same thing, from maybe palm trees, and this is like temara, tamar. So in the Bible, it's called tamar, meaning palm. So the two, the names, the English and Hebrew names come from the same place. This was an important place because for some time it was an independent little kingdom, separate from Rome. Eventually, in the 3rd century, it was taken over by Rome. There's a little history here. Grew powerful in the middle of the 3rd century. Its ruler established him as a great power under Roman patronage with his wife. He destroyed the city of Nehar De'ah, which was a big, important center of learning for the rabbis. And they reigned over Eretz Yisrael. His wife did. Apparently, Jews opposed these rulers and treated them with hostility and contempt. So there was tension between the Jewish community and the rulers of Tadmor, Palmyra. So that'll explain some of what we're about to show. In the year 273, the Roman Emperor Aurelian conquered Tadmor, and that's it. Then it was no longer an independent entity. Okay, so this is a fascinating place, and here's a bit of archaeology of what it looked like back then. All right, so anyway, what's the story about people that live in Talmud that we are afraid that some of them are Jewish mamzerim, and therefore we cannot accept them as converts? We want them to just stay in their place. Even if they're Jewish, we'd rather they live among non-Jews than bring them into the Jewish community, because anyone they marry in the Jewish community will then, their children will be mamzerim. So we don't want that to happen. So what happened there? Peligi bar Rabbi Yochanan v'Sabya. Rabbi Yochanan and the elders have two understandings. Chadamar mishum abdeh shelomo. One of the, whoever says which, we don't know. One of them dates it back to the first Bet HaMikdash, where we have a tradition that Shlomo HaMelech built a city there in Talmud, and he had non-Jewish servants who were wealthy and important, and they may have taken in marriage Jewish women. And so you have non-Jews now taking Jewish women, and their children, according to this opinion, are mamzerim. Now, this is not the halacha. And according to halacha, if a non-Jew has a child with a Jew, the children are not mamzerim, although it's prohibited. But in this opinion, it seems to be that they are mamzerim. And that's what happened. It goes back to the first Bet HaMikdash, and that's where we're afraid of. The other historical version is Chadamar Mishum Benot Yerushalayim. This would be during later on, when the daughters of Jerusalem were taken captive among these people, and were raped and had children. So this might have been later on in the second Bet HaMikdash period. Or maybe even later, when there were tensions between the people of Palmyra and the Jewish cities like Nehar De'ah, as we read here. So it might have been during that later time period that the non-Jews and the non-Jews took the Jewish women and had children with them and caused mamzerut. Okay, another way of understanding where the mamzerut comes from is not necessarily from the couples, from the non-Jews and Jews, but rather if they were Jewish women, then their children would be Jewish, but they're living in non-Jewish lands because they're under those slaves or under those conquerors, and then those Jews may be marrying illegally those people who are married or relatives or whatever, and therefore the mamzerut could happen in later generations as well. So that it's not they're living under non-Jews, not barely even though they're Jewish, and so no one is looking after keeping track of marriages and divorces and proper marriages, and so therefore for either of those two reasons we have to suspect that people from this place may be Jewish mamzerim, and that's why we will not accept them as converts into the Jewish community. Bishlama lemanda mar mishum avdeh shelomo kasabar goy ve'evet haba al bat Yisrael havalad mamzer. So we understand, according to the opinion that says it goes back to the first Bet HaMikdash, and a Jew or a slave, a non-Canaanite slave who comes upon an Israelite woman, a Jewish woman, the child will be a mamzer, according to that opinion. But if it happens during, because of the daughters of Jerusalem that were taken there, and so what does that have to do with Talmud? Peligi bar Yosef Rabbanan, v'tarvayu mishmed Rabba bar Hana. Oh, so if they came to Jerusalem, what does Talmud have to do with the daughters of Jerusalem in the second version? And so this is a machloket between Rabbi Yosef and Rabbanan, both in the name of Rabba bar Hana. Hadamar Teresad alfei Gabre v'shita alfei kashtoye. This is talking about the enemies from Talmud that came upon Jerusalem to conquer Jerusalem. How many were there that came from Talmud? Some say, one opinion says 12,000 soldiers and 6,000 archers, 18,000 altogether. Another one said, no, 12,000 altogether, 6,000 of them were archers and 6,000 were soldiers. It doesn't matter. Either way, when the various non-Jewish conquerors came and entered into the Hechal, so this would be during the Roman conquest, they found everyone was going and looking for gold and silver to take. But these people from Talmud, these soldiers and archers, hem nifnu benot Yerushalayim, they weren't interested in the gold and silver, but they were going after the maidens of Jerusalem. Shene'emar nashim b'Sion inu betulot b'arei Yehuda. Right, the women were tortured or were raped in Sion and in Arei Yehuda. So there you go. Although they were from far away from Talmud, so the first one version is that it's the king Shlomo who built in there, and so whatever Jews were living there were taken by the non-Jewish servants. But this version says it's the people from Talmud that came to Jerusalem and conquered, and then took women and took them back with them. And that's why we have to worry that people in the population of Talmud may be Jewish and may be mamzerim. Amar Rabbi Shemuel bar Nachmani Amar Rabbi Yonatan pasuk zeh sad haolam amaro. So that's the end of that discussion. But in the previous discussion, we did mention this pasuk in the story of Rabbi Dosa, Nar hayiti gam zakanti. And our question now is, who said this? And Rabbi Shemuel says it's the angel that's appointed over the world. There are angels for everything. There's like a chief angel. There's angels for maybe every country for different tasks. But there's an angel that the Creator appointed over the whole world to take charge. Okay, so he says that angel said it, because who else could have said it? Man amare ile makucha berichu. Did Hashem himself say, "I was young and now I'm old"? Could God ever say, "I was young and now I was old"? Does God age? No, that's impossible. Did David HaMelech, right, who we assume is the author of Tehillim, could he have said this? He died when he was 70 years old. So he was never old enough that he would say, "Oh, now I'm very old, and I have from experience, I see that right, I was young and I was old. I've never seen a righteous forsaken or his children begging for bread." He was never old. Rather, it must be the angel appointed over the world, who was around from the time of creation until now, and can testify throughout all of creation, right? I never saw such a thing, that a good person will go without, or that their children will be begging. Okay, this is a difficult pasuk, because it never happens that a good person may become very poor and not have what to eat. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has an interesting comment on this explanation, and he says, I never saw this happen, because anytime I saw a good person poor, I would go help them out. I would make sure that they weren't begging. So that's why I never saw a poor person or their children begging and wanting for food, because I always made sure to help them. So that's a nice explanation of the pasuk. Amar Rabbi Shemuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Ma dichtiv yado paras sar al kol machamadeha. A pasuk from Echa. And that says the enemies have spread out their hand all upon the treasures of Yerushalayim, and entered her temple. And what you said, Hashem, that they may not enter. Okay, who is it referring to? What enemies came into the Bet HaMikdash and plundered it? Ze Amon and Moab. This goes back also. We remember the second halacha in the name of Chagai was that the lands of Amon and Moab, which were conquered are not considered part of Israel, and that's why you can grow things there during Shavuot. So now we're coming back and mentioning them again in the Agadah, and it says B'shashin chunsu goyim lahechal hakol nifnu al kesef vezahav hem nifnu al sifrei Torah. It also relates to what we just said before. All the other enemies were going and looking for silver and gold, but Amon and Moab, they were zeroing in on looking for the sifrei Torah. Amru zeh shekatuv bo lo yavo Amoni u'Moavi bikal Hashem yisaref ba'esh. They had an axe to grind, because they knew that in the Torah it says one may not marry an Ammonite or a Moabite, and they said we want to find that document that speaks derogatorily about us, and we're going to burn it by fire. So that was more important to them than the gold and silver, and so that's what it's talking about. That the enemies came and burnt that which was precious. Meaning. Concerning which you commanded that they should not enter, right? So that's the second half explains the second half of the pasuk, that you commanded they not enter refers not to the kodesh, not to the kodesh, where people may not enter, even Jews, non-Kohanim may not enter, even non-Jews cannot enter, but rather it's referring to Amon and Moab, who may not marry into the Jewish community. Okay, finally, Siva Adonai Yaakov Sibibav Sarav, and more from another later pasuk in Echa, that Hashem commanded the enemies around to come upon, to surround Yaakov. The surrounding, right, reminds us of the surrounding before, with surrounding with arguments that they plan to do to the Dosa. Amarav Kigon Homanya Lefum Nahara. You want to know an example? A city, Homanya, is a non-Jewish city, and they go and the Ammon, people from Ammon who live there, they harass the Jews that live in Pum Nahara. So you see that's a fulfillment of this pasuk in Echa. Okay, a little bit more. Amarav Yehuda Amarav Aseh Goy Shekidesh Bazman Hazeh Choshishin Lekidushin Shema Maaset Hashivatim Hu. Says something amazing, that if a non-Jew nowadays would go and find a Jewish woman and give her a ring and say Haret Mekudeshet Li, we worry that this may be an actual Kedushin and we're going to require them to get a get. Now this is very strange, because the halacha is a non-Jew is not compatible with a Jew if they try to do Kiddushin. The Kiddushin is nothing. So how come he says that we have to worry that the Kiddushin does take effect? Because Shema Maaset Hashivatim Hu. Who knows, maybe this non-Jew is actually not a non-Jew, is actually a descendant of one of the 10 tribes. And so, since they may be one of the descendants of 10 tribes, maybe they're Jewish. And therefore, maybe the Kiddushin works. So this is amazing. We ask about this. We have a principle that anything that separates from a majority, we follow the majority. Like if you find a piece of meat in the middle of a street and there's 10 kosher stores and one non-kosher store, 9 kosher and 1 not kosher, you can assume that this is kosher. We follow the majority. Once something moves out of its place, we follow the majority of sources where it came from. And therefore, most people come from non-Jewish. There's a lot more non-Jewish countries than Jewish, and there's only one Jewish country. So we can assume that they are not Jewish. And the answer is Beduchta de Kebi. No, maybe it's talking about a place that the non-Jews settled in. That the 10 Shevatim settled in. That they went there during when the Ashur, back in the 700s BCE, they moved people all around, right? The Assyrians came and they moved lots of people all around so that they would no longer rebel against their rule. And they put people in a certain place. If they went to a certain place and we know where it is and they stayed there for centuries and centuries, then it's not a place that left the majority, because there's another rule that once something is in its place, like if you have 9 stores, 9 kosher markets, butchers, and one non-kosher, and you went into one and bought something, but don't remember which one it is, then we assume 50-50 because it didn't leave its place so that we could follow the majority of stores. It was in one store. We just don't know which one it is. So for each store in and of itself, we have to assume 50-50. And therefore, since it's not someone that moved around, but someone that was in that city the whole time, therefore, we have to assume 50-50 chance that they may be Jewish and the Kiddushin took effect. Pasuk in Kings that talks about the different places that Ashur sent those who lived in the north. And what are these places? We're going to identify them. Chelach ze Chalzon, Chabor ze Hadjab, Nahar Gozan zo Gin Zak, Vare Madai zo Hamadan, Vechebroteha, Vamrila zo Nihar, Vechebroteha. Okay, so here's different cities, and you can place them on the map all around Syria, Iraq. Vechebroteha man, Amashemel Kerach, Mushchi, Chidke, Vedomakya. And what are the surroundings? So he gave these cities, that's where they are. Amar Be'ochanan v'cholan lifsul. And all these are disqualified, right? And someone that comes from any of these places, we have to assume that they were originally from one of the 10 tribes. And when they went to the other places, then they intermarried, and they were not careful with laws of who they married and only have permitted marriages. And therefore, we have to assume that their children are mamzerim. And therefore, we cannot accept them as converts. We have to assume that they're mamzerim, and we should stay away from them in marriage. Okay, so we'll stop here. This fasting discussion will continue on the next daf. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.